of 2022, I was praying and I was spending some time thinking about and trying to even plan a little bit ahead for 2023. And I was praying, God, what is something that we could focus on as a church? What is it that you want us to spend time? And even as we look ahead, we were thinking about what is our vision for 2025? What's our vision for 2027? Because, by the way, in 2027, we will be a church that's 100 years old. Right? We will be 100 years old. We don't look it, though, That's what I'm saying, right? But I was praying about that and asking God, what is it something that, that you want to say to us? What do you want to speak to us about? And for some reason, as I was praying about that and thinking about it, the phrase, for all sons and daughters, started coming into my mind. And so I started thinking about that, and I started praying about that. I started thinking about how many conversations I've had with parents and with grandparents whose hearts were heavy and broken for their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters, for people in their life that had walked away from the church, who had walked away from faith. And so I started thinking, what does it mean to be a church for all sons and daughters? What does it look like? Because in those prayers and in those moments that I've listened to these conversations that I even had with these folks, and they've said in their prayers that praying that someone would walk into their lives, that someone would remind them that God loves them, that they would be led back to Jesus. And so I came back to that for all sons and daughters. And what does it look like to be a church that is for all sons and daughters? A church that is aware that everyone is a son and daughter. Everyone is. That every single week we have sons and daughters who walk through our doors, who spend time in this building. What does it look like to be a church for all sons and daughters? And even as we've been talking about the building edition and what that looks like and how to keep in mind and to welcome and to connect people and for future sons and daughters. So we're starting this series called For All Sons and Daughters. And this week, as I was praying about where God would want us to go and talking about this, the first story that came to my mind in the book of John in the New Testament, John chapter 9, there's a story of a man who was born blind. He was born blind, and his whole life he had spent not seeing and having to beg and find his way around. And the way the story goes in John chapter 9, it begins like this. It says, Jesus was walking along and he saw a man who'd been born blind, right? And he's with his disciples, and his disciples ask him, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? They said, was it because of his own sins? Because surely he had done something wrong, maybe, right? Like surely. Or was it his parents' sins? Somebody's got to be blamed. But Jesus says it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins. He says, this happened so the power of God could be seen in him. Here's what Jesus was saying to them, basically. What looks like a horrible, worst kind of situation, God is going to bring something good out of it. Just what we sang about, right? Even this situation with this man who's blind, I am going to show you what God can do in the midst of it. And what unfolds in the midst of that, and what unfolds in the remaining of that story, Jesus even goes on to say, this is where he says, I am the light of the world. And Jesus is not only going to end up opening this man's eyes and giving him sight, he's going to open the eyes of others and try to help them see. In fact, what happens next in this story, it says, Jesus, then he spit on the ground. This is going to pick it up in verse 6. Made mud with the saliva and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came back seeing, right? He can see now. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, but others said, get this, no, he just looks like him. There's the brains of the bunch, right? But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the same one. Now, this causes this incredible disturbance in the community, right? They knew this guy as the blind beggar. This was the label they had put on him, right? Don't get outside that label. We don't know what to do with you, right? So, of course, if he's not blind, surely it's not him. And no matter how much the guy tried to convince them that it really was him, the perplexity of the miracle couldn't overcome their blindness to see him any differently. They only knew him as the blind beggar, and nothing was going to change how they saw him. Maybe even not the very fact that he was blind no longer. And on top of all this, really the icing on the cake was that this guy, Jesus, had used mud to heal him on the Sabbath, on the day of rest. Now you could all be like, how could Jesus do that? And so because this all happened, and because they're so perplexed, they decide we need to go and get some help to get this straightened out. In fact, it says they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees, these religious leaders, right? Now, this is wild to me, this whole story that unfolds here. It didn't matter what had happened for the blind guy. It didn't matter that he could see. The fact that Jesus did something they deemed as wrong, the fact that Jesus did something outside of their little box that they had God in, they needed to get some answers. And after there's this back and forth that goes on between the Pharisees and this guy and the neighbors and all of them trying to figure out how this could happen, after they literally called Jesus an ordinary sinner, well, they decide to do some deeper investigation. Let's look at verse 18. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see. He must have never been blind, right? That sounds like some people's answer. So they called in his parents. They asked him, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" And his parents replied, "We know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He is old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Imagine that, afraid of the religious people, right? Who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. And that's why they said he was old enough. Ask him. Can we talk about this situation for a moment with the parents in particular? To me, this is so frustrating, right? These religious leaders, these neighbors, these people who are all worked up about this situation, they could care less about the good that's happened, right? They could care less about the fact that the guy is actually getting helped. That a person who was literally in darkness, who has had to beg his whole life for help, he suddenly gets a new chance at life. And it's not enough to take his word at it. They have to call in his parents. Let's put ourselves in this parent's shoes for a moment, right? Let's think about what it must have been like for them. This should have been a time to celebrate, right? This should have been a time to be filled with so much joy and hope. You know that as parents, they've carried guilt in their lives, because especially in that particular time when so many people would blame the parents for what had happened to the kids, they must have done something wrong. And you know that they've wondered, what did we do to have a child like this? You know that they spent time in prayer and that there were a lot of tears begging God, what have we done? What have we done? Why has this happened to us? And now their son can see. This should have been the most amazing experience in their life. But instead, they're drug in to be interrogated. They're drug in to be embarrassed and humiliated, as if to be made to feel even bad about the fact that he's healed. Isn't that wild? So let's keep going. Verse 24. So for the second time, they called in the man who'd been blind and told him, God should get the glory for this, because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And the man replied, I don't know whether he is a sinner, but I know this, and this is one of the most famous lines. Would you say this with me together? I was blind, and now I can see. Now, you would think that they would have been all so moved by what he said. They would have been just, their hearts blessed to overflowing. But in reality, it just ticked them off even more. In fact, the guy goes on to say something like, do you want to be his disciples? He might have poked the bear a little bit. And it sends them over the edge. Verse 28. Then they cursed him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from, talking about Jesus. Now, listen to this guy. He said, why, that's very strange. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. This man is speaking from experience. He says of Jesus, if this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. Boy, they say, this is their response. You were born a total sinner. Are you trying to teach us? Will you read the last line with me? This is what they did. And they threw him out of the synagogue. They threw him out. Pretty much what they're doing is they're kicking him out of the community. They made it clear to him, you don't belong here. They might as well have said, God doesn't want you. In fact, their motto might as well have been, God doesn't want sinners. They should have just painted it on the building, right? This son who was blind from birth, the fact that he could see now wasn't enough to speak to their hearts. Their hearts were as cold and as hard as the Pharaoh who had led their people, who had held their people captives in slavery and wouldn't let them go. Their hearts were that cold and resistant to God that they'd rather a person stay blind than be healed by Jesus. They'd rather a person stay blind than be healed by Jesus. Now, you know why they decided this guy didn't have a right to lecture them, or why Jesus was the way he was in their eyes? Here's why. Because they thought it was their job to determine who was a sinner and who wasn't. They thought it was their job to determine who was in and who wasn't. Now, just to be clear, let's talk about the Pharisees, these religious leaders, for just a moment. They really had done a great job for the people of Israel. Back when the people of Israel were in exile or they were in captivity, it was the Pharisees who were actually the ones who would remind the people of who they were, who would remind them of their identity, to remind them to stay anchored to God, to don't forget that they are God's people. The problem was, though, that they had become so consumed with playing defense that they forgot the other reasons that they were considered the people of God. And when Jesus shows up, when Jesus says that he embodies everything that Israel is supposed to be, when Jesus sits down with the woman at the well, when Jesus stands up for the woman caught in adultery, when Jesus spends time with people who are considered unclean and contagious, when Jesus breaks down all the walls that they had built up to keep quote unquote sinners out, Well, the only thing they can conclude is Jesus must be a sinner too. And here Jesus comes along and heals this man, this son who had been born blind since birth. Jesus does it. I want to tell you, this is my first point. If you're following along the notes and quotes in the app, my first point is this: Jesus is for all sons and daughters. Jesus is for all sons and daughters. In fact, the rest of the story goes like this. Jesus hears that they had kicked him out of the synagogue, that they had basically said he is cut off, basically making it known to him that God doesn't want him because they don't want him. And Jesus finds this man, and when he finds this man that he had healed, he asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man says, of course, wanting to know, who is this? And I'll believe in him if you'll show me who he is. And Jesus responds to the man, hey, you're talking to him, buddy. It is me. And listen to what the man says in verse 38. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said. And he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see they are blind. Ooh. I was thinking about what type of church we want to be. And the reality is, this is why we zero in so much on what do we want to be known for. Because we choose, right? We can choose to be known for what Jesus is known for, or we can be like the Pharisees. We can either choose to tear down obstacles, or we can be like the Pharisees that try to make sure people know that God doesn't want them. God doesn't want sinners. See, their intentions were, for the most part, probably good, but they were misguided. They were actually doing more harm than they were doing good. And Jesus was so focused on reaching all sons and daughters, people who thought that they weren't worthy. There's another really good story like this. It's the story of Zacchaeus. I love all these stories because it's like, this is Jesus. This is who Jesus is, right? There's the story of Zacchaeus found in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 19. Zacchaeus is this tax collector, and to be a tax collector in that particular society, in that culture, well, there wasn't much worse thing you could do. Yeah, I don't know if a lot of things have changed, but it was real bad back then. Because they saw this as like someone who steals from them. Because what they would often do, these tax collectors, they would skim off the top. They'd go in, Rome would send them in to collect, and Rome would tell them, take whatever you want. And so these people who were supposed to be fellow Jews would steal from anybody they wanted to, skimming off the top under the label of collecting taxes. Pretty bad guy. Zacchaeus heard that Jesus was coming to his community. And on the day that Jesus was coming, there had been a big old crowd that wanted to see Jesus. Jesus at the height of Jesus' popularity. They wanted to see Jesus, and so Zacchaeus was having a hard time seeing, and he actually climbs a tree to try to get a good view of Jesus. And the way the story goes is Jesus comes to town, he sees Zacchaeus up in this tree, and he tells Zacchaeus, come down, I'm coming to your house. I want to be a guest at your house. In fact, let's pick it up here. It says, Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. Oh, come on. Here's another group. Listen to what they say about Jesus. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner. They're probably not wrong. Let's be honest. They're probably not wrong. Now, meanwhile, so they're at Zacchaeus' house. They're at this dinner party where everybody's disgusted with Jesus for being at. And Zacchaeus, in front of everyone, before Jesus, in front of Jesus, he says this to Jesus. He says, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. Man, just having Jesus in his home, just being around Jesus, it changes Zacchaeus' heart. Zacchaeus responds. Clearly, Zacchaeus knows he'd been doing some wrong stuff. Clearly, Zacchaeus knew that his actions and his attitude had been sinful. Jesus says, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. Basically what he's saying Zacchaeus gets it. Zacchaeus realizes. Jesus says, for the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. I love this story. I mean, here Jesus goes again, right? Doesn't Jesus know who he's hanging out with? You know that saying, birds of a feather flock together? Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. Jesus is going where he's welcomed. And let's be honest, as we've seen throughout Jesus' ministry, he's not welcomed by everyone, particularly those who think they've got it all figured out, those who think they've got God all figured out and in a box. He's not welcomed by those who don't want to really see the world as God does. Jesus is welcomed by people who realize they can't save themselves. My second point today is Jesus goes where he's welcomed. Jesus goes where he's welcomed. And Jesus saw in Zacchaeus a heart that was open to him. He saw a desire in Zacchaeus to be seen, to be wanted. Zacchaeus clearly knew all the mess that he had, all the baggage, all the things. And I know, it's weird, right? Jesus says, I'm going to be a guest in your house. It wasn't just that Jesus invited himself over. He saw in Zacchaeus a desire for him. Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, there's this whole section that talks about the final judgment and what it means to welcome Jesus, not just in the end, but how to live a life that welcomes Jesus, that sees Jesus. You see, when I think about that story of Zacchaeus, going back to that for a second, going into Zacchaeus' home, do you know what it's like to be in somebody's house? Do you know what it's like to be invited into somebody's house? I've had people in my house, when you have somebody over to stay in your house, there's a level of vulnerability, right? A level of vulnerability. Like, when you stay at somebody's house, there's a very good chance you might see them in the morning before they get coffee. And there's a version of Aaron, pre-coffee, that I don't really want the whole world to see. But if you're at my house, you might see it in the morning. There's a vulnerability that happens. And when I think about this verse here in Matthew 25, when Jesus talks about where we see him and how we've welcomed him, when he says, he's explaining this, and listen to what he says. He says, in the final judgment, he says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. And this last part of 35, just this last part of the sentence, would you read that with me? I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. Just that part of 35, I want to focus on just for a moment. I was a stranger, right? And you invited me into your home. It really struck me as I was thinking about this being a church for all sons and daughters. And in particular, when we think about the space we have here, whether we do anything, any addition or not, I hope we will always be a place that welcomes people into our space. This is something that our church has done over and over again. Even before I was the pastor, you've been a welcoming people, but I've really seen this unfold in the last few years. About 4 years ago, we had a school or it was a program. It wasn't even a school completely yet. A program that was going to start a school here in the Carolinas, and they needed a place to land. It was going to be a school for children who had severe needs, and schools and families didn't have the resources to help them. The name of the school was Melmark, and they approached us. They asked, they had about 3 kids signed up for the program at the time, and they said, could we use your facilities? And one of the things that I love about our facility is every single day it is used. Whether it's a basketball program from the community that uses it, the daycare that uses it, different homeschool groups or different organizations that need a place to land to just be together, every single day of the week, our facility is used. And I love that. But we received a letter because this Melmark school, they actually moved out last fall because they had grown out of the space and they had a new space. And about 3 weeks ago, we got a letter from them. And I wanted to share this with you. They wrote, and it says, we are truly thankful for how generous you were in leasing us space, which gave us the time we needed to build our school to a point where we could move into our own building. He spoke to us about that, and he says, but Melmark really does serve some of the most vulnerable individuals in society. They are complex and have extensive support needs, no doubt. Because of that, these children are typically left without any supports in their life beyond their family. Even school, something that every child should be able to access, is denied to them as they are told they can only attend for an hour or 2 per week. It is because of these extensive needs that so few places will even tolerate the children we serve, much less accept them. Beyond the children, imagine the stress this puts on families who often cannot work and fall into poverty. The thing is, these children can get better. They can learn and make progress if given the chance. This is what Melmark is about, giving these children a chance by providing them with stable, consistent, sophisticated services day in and day out so they can learn new skills and families can resume their lives. I mean, some of the students we served were cycling in and out of the emergency room due to their behaviors and told they would have to live in an institution for the rest of their lives. However, now they are living happily at home and holding down a job in the community. Their family still says the services we provided within your walls saved their child and their family. He says, I know it was not always easy. That's the truth. Now listen, they were hard on the facilities. However, I also know we would not have been able to grow our school, establish a permanent location, and be in a place to permanently change the supports available to this vulnerable group without the support of you and the church. For that reason, I wanted to take a minute to send this letter expressing our sincere gratitude. Your generosity has changed the lives of 36 children who we served in your building and has set the stage to do the same for untold future families. Now, listen. The truth is, everything we do reflects on Jesus. But there are certain things we must do that reflect Jesus. And whatever we decide to do about the building situation, we have to do this. This is my last point. We have to welcome others to Jesus. We have to welcome others to Jesus. So how do we do that? The truth is, we do that by welcoming people just like we've been welcomed, to remember that Jesus has welcomed us. We read the words from Matthew chapter 11, the invitation that Jesus gives, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls." This is the invitation of Jesus. This is the invitation we must convey to the world as a church. Jesus says to everyone, to all sons and daughters, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Would you stand? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes as we move into a time of reflection? Maybe today you needed to hear that Jesus is for you. Jesus is for you. You are a son and daughter that Jesus cares about. And whatever that need is in your life, He wants to help you. Maybe today you are carrying around sin that is holding you back, that is blinding you, that is keeping you from seeing His love. Maybe today your attitude, your pridefulness, maybe today there's something that is keeping you from experience the rest and the healing and the wholeness that comes from Jesus. And today I want to tell you something. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." Jesus welcomes you. Jesus welcomes you. We have a prayer that we do each week. If you haven't given your life to Jesus, I want to invite you today to give your life to Jesus. It's a simple prayer, and it goes like this: Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I confess I need forgiveness for my sins. Jesus, I trust that you do forgive me, and I receive your love. The scriptures say that if we confess our sins, He is faithful. Jesus goes where He's welcomed. He's inviting you. He's calling you. Give Him your life. Give Him your heart. Maybe you need to recommit. Maybe you need something to stir within you again, a love, a hope, a peace. Jesus welcomes you. God, thank you for the sense of your presence in this room. Thank you for speaking to us, for reminding us that you are for all sons and daughters. I pray, God, we will never lose sight of that. We'll never let it go. We'll pursue, we'll seek, we'll love with your love. We'll care. God, I pray that today we would say yes to your will and to your leading. Yes to you. For it's in your name I pray. Amen.